Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm back again with another chapter from A. Edward Newton's book, This Book Collecting Game. This chapter is chapter 3, The Books of My Boyhood. Sometime since, I sat next to a handsome woman at dinner, and in the course of conversation, she made some remark which led me to inquire if she had not once had an Aunt Charlotte. The question made her think for a moment, and then she replied, "Yes, if one can have an aunt who died before one is born. Why do you ask?" "Because," I said, "she gave me a book when I was a child, in which she wrote, 'I hope Eddie will grow up to be a fine Christian gentleman.' It was a wide opening, and in a flash she filled it. I am glad Aunt Charlotte died before she was disappointed." I only quote the incident to show what I once was. In my case, the child was not the father of the man. Much and earnest care went into my bringing up. My sponsors in baptism took their duties very seriously. As they promised, I was made to hear sermons at a tender age, and long before I could read, I learned by heart texts from the Bible, collects from the prayer book, and bits of poetry. At least that is what it was called, which were designed to stop the growth of the old Adam, which was supposed to reside in every child. I grew up at a time when children, and too often grown-ups, were sighted. I am horrified to think how often the boy stood on the burning deck in the person of AEN, and I never recalled the incident without thinking of Dr. Johnson's saying, "Let both little dears recite at the same time. This will make the more noise, which will please them and get it over sooner, which will please me." To this day, I can, upon sufficient inducement, recite "Little Samuel woke" and "'Twas God that made the little fly, if you pinch it, it will die." And this I know to be a fact, for I tried not once but several times. I fear I was a very bad little boy. The efforts to make a prig of me mercifully failed, but they did make me a sturdy reader, and for this I cannot be too thankful. The first book I remember reading was a thin, small, square volume bound in dark maroon-colored cloth, called Jessica's First Prayer, and all recollection of the book had passed completely out of my head until last summer, when prowling in a parish church in the west of England, I came upon a large and elaborate mural tablet erected to the glory of God and in loving memory of the author of Jessica's First Prayer. For over half a century the thought of that book had not occurred to me, but when upon my return I searched for and found the little volume tied up in a bundle with perhaps a dozen other books of my early childhood, I was quite delighted, and taking it up, I turned its leaves and looked at the quaint woodcuts with a curious sensation. And here is a small image of Jessica's First Prayer. A few days afterward, meeting my friend Dr. Horace Howard Furness, the eminent Shakespearean, who has read everything and forgets nothing, I asked him about Jessica's First Prayer, and was not surprised to find that he knew it almost by heart. Someone had read it to him. Evidently, all little boys of our generation were brought up on the book. I asked him, too, if he remembered the exquisite little woodcuts which ornamented its pages. Of course he did, but in that bundle I found other books, one of them so famous that I stopped whatever I was then reading and devoted some time to them and their history. This is one of the joys of desultory reading. Have you ever heard of Sandford and Merton? Probably yes. Have you ever read it? Probably no. Listen then till I tell you what it is about. In 1748, in London, in Wellclose Square to be exact, and Wellclose Square is in Whitechapel, there was born Thomas Day. His father was a collector of customs, and dying when his son was only a year old, he left him an estate of £1,200 a year, out of which was to be paid an annuity of £300 a year to his mother. From this it will be seen how important male babies were in England at that time, and how unimportant the mothers, who were indeed regarded rather as incubators that had served their purpose. In due course, young Day went to Charterhouse and subsequently to Oxford, but he did not take a degree. At Oxford he met and became intimate with Richard Lovell Edgeworth, who was to become the father of the more famous Maria of that ilk. Young Day was eccentric and rich, for a large sum had accumulated during his minority, but in due course he felt the need for a wife, and looking about him, he found no one who filled the requirements which to him appeared necessary. His wife must be well-born, beautiful, and virtuous, yet have contempt for dress and polite society. She was not to be a blue-stocking, yet she was to have a taste for literature, science, and moral philosophy. She was to be shy and retiring, yet as fearless and intrepid as a Roman mother. And under no circumstances was she to indulge herself in the vapours, which was a retreat into which every 18th century girl retired upon occasion. This might be called a large order, not easily fulfilled, and Day finally decided that it would be best for him to train 2 virtuous maidens to meet his requirements, setting about the job in a manner that foreshadowed failure. Gentlemen prefer blondes, but they occasionally marry brunettes, and, not knowing in which direction his fancy would permanently set, Day for the moment chose both. Object matrimony was his slogan as he presented himself at an orphan asylum at Shrewsbury, and there chose an auburn brunette of handsome appearance. And he was still of this mind when, a few days later, he visited good Captain Coram's well-known foundling hospital in London and selected a peachy blonde with flaxen hair, both girls being about 12 years of age. However, respectable charities do not hand over the pick of the nest to the keeping of ardent young men without guarantees, but with the help of a barrister named Bicknell and young Edward, who is married, Day put his name to such agreements as satisfied the authorities that his project was to secure a faultless wife or perish in the attempt. He agreed, in fact, that if he did not marry either girl, he would set them up in a reputable business, and if and when either married, he would present bride or brides with substantial dotes. In other words, their hope chests were to be well filled. Edgeworth was an eccentric, too. He became the father of 18 children out of 4 wives, married in quick succession. One of the children, Maria, the favourite, was very short, and her he sought to lengthen by stretching her, but after almost killing her, he gave it up. She was the eldest of the crop. Is it any wonder that when she took pen in hand to write books, her most successful performance was the parent's assistant? No doubt she was. When all the necessary formalities were attended to, young Day took his foundlings, one on either hand, and proceeded to the south of France. He chose France as the place of their education, in order that they might in no wise be contaminated by English-speaking persons, and as neither girl could read or write, he worked in every sense in virgin soil. How Day endeavored to educate and train the girls, how they quarreled and hated each other, and agreed only on one thing, their disgust for their trainer, how they fell ill of the smallpox and other things, and how he nursed them through their illnesses and the subsequent miseries, all this may be imagined. But the earnest young man was not easily discouraged. His educational methods were original and frequently severe. It was his habit, in order to strengthen the girls' nerves, to discharge pistols, which they believed to be loaded, at their petticoats, while to teach them to bear pain unflinchingly he would drop melting sealing wax upon their bare arms. One is reminded of Teasing Tom in Patience. He, it will be remembered, punched his poor little sisters' heads, and cayenne peppered their 4-post beds. He plastered their hair with cobbler's wax, and dropped hot halfpennies down their backs. But to leave the Teasing Tom of poetry and return to the Teasing Tom of real life, as the girls grew older and handsomer, Day endeavored to keep from them any idea of their beauty, and repressed as far as he was able their love of dress and any knowledge of the use of money. It was about the wildest piece of folly a well-meaning man ever engaged in, and the result could have been foreseen. One girl, the blonde, disappeared, and the other, Sarah, otherwise Sabrina, married not Day, but his friend Bicknell, receiving from her guardian for such Day had constituted himself a wedding gift of £500. Indeed, his conduct throughout the whole proceeding was as fine as it was foolish. But meantime Day was without a wife, and now, looking about in a more normal manner, he met a Miss Milnes of suitable age and accomplishments, but unluckily, in his view, the possessor of a considerable fortune. This Day insisted should be placed entirely beyond his control, and on these terms they were happily married, and to the amazement of all, lived happily even after, the wife adapting herself to her husband in a manner now as out of date as a hoop skirt. The first year of their married life they spent in Hampstead, but after that time, in order that they might better shun what Day thought the infectious taint of polite society, they determined to settle in the country, and Day acquired a small estate in Essex, wishing to make some additions to the house he described to be his own architect. But as he declined to be troubled about such matters as doors and windows, The result was singularly unsatisfactory. On one occasion, we are told, when a mason suggested that a window be put in a certain room, Day, declined to be interrupted in a book he was reading, instructed the mason to continue building the wall, saying that the window could be put in later. It was Mrs. Day's dressing room, and as the window was never put in, the lady had to make all her toilets by candlelight. But with all these eccentricities, Thomas Day was a fine man. Thoroughly impractical, he lost money in everything he undertook. But none of his poor neighbors' wants went unsupplied. Food and medicines for the sick and needy were always ready. And he reached one eminently sane conclusion. The result of all my speculations, he said, about humanity is that the only way of permanently benefiting mankind is to give them employment and make them earn money. His farming projects were as unusual as his building operations, and he lost money by everything he did. He gradually separated himself from a considerable part of his fortune, but he gave up his carriage, and his wife her maid, and there was no word of complaint. Such, then, was the man who wrote Sandford and Merton, a book which you could now scarcely hire a boy to read, but which was for almost a century, if not enormously popular, at least enormously read. Perhaps we were made to read it. It is the story of a bad little rich boy and a good little poor boy, with parents to match, and a Mr. Barlow who improves every occasion with a pious anecdote. Mr. Barlow is, in fact, a sort of prototype for Mr. George in the Rollo books, than which no better books for boys were ever written. Mr. Barlow found tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, and sermons, especially sermons, in everything. The tale of Sandford and Merton drags its tedious length through 3 volumes, its first edition, being interrupted by countless anecdotes which have no connection whatever with the main story, if indeed there is a main story, but which were calculated to instill a love of truth, industry, humanity, and rest into the reader. Thus we have the story of Androcles and the lion, which very naturally leads up to a story of an elephant, which was one of my favorites. It appears that an elephant once made the acquaintance of a certain tailor, and as it passed the tailor's shop daily on the way to a pond for a drink, it became its habit of sticking its trunk through an open window, whereat the tailor was sitting. He used to feed it cakes or something, until finally the elephant never passed the window without sticking its trunk in to be fed. Well, one day the tailor was in a very bad humor, and instead of feeding the elephant, he stuck a needle in his trunk, hurting it severely, whereupon the elephant withdrew its trunk, but, saying nothing, went on its way down the street to the pond, and after it had a good drink, it filled its trunk with dirty water, and went back to the tailor and discharged the water all over, and nearly drowned him. I especially like this story, probably for the reason that the moral was not sticking out, as was usually the case, unless it be that it is dangerous to monkey with an elephant, which one would think its size would suggest. Another story. There was once a man who grew so enormously fat and gouty from lack of exercise and overeating that he was finally forced to consult a physician. The physician listened to him and said he could cure him, but the patient must promise to do exactly as he was told. This he agreed to, whereupon he was deprived of food and placed in a small room, the floor of which was composed of iron plates, which could be made very hot. After the man had been locked in the room, the floor was heated, and he, to keep his feet from being burned, was obliged to hop vigorously about, first on one foot and then on the other. In this way he was made to take such exercise as finally cured him of the gout. One more. Harry Sandford, the good boy, one day so far forgot himself as to fasten with a bent pin to a piece of a string of cockchafer, which he whirled about him, much to the discomfort of the insect. When it was explained to him that the cockchafer suffered greatly from these proceedings, Harry burst into tears and took the insect home and nursed it and fed it on green leaves for a fortnight, until it was entirely recovered, whereupon he asked it out to enjoy its liberty. How many times did I ask myself what and how large is a cockchafer? To my youthful imagination, I thought it must be about as large as a bird. Judge then of my disappointment when I discovered that a cockchafer is a sort of June bug. Never do I see a June bug on its back vigorously exercising its limbs without thinking of Harry Sandford. I never liked Harry. In real life, no one, I think, likes a good boy, except perhaps maiden uncles or aunts. Mr. Merton, I am sure, liked Harry because the boy gave him an opportunity to show off. Everyone likes to do that. I do myself, but my opportunities are few. I have said that the first edition of Sandford and Merton is in 3 volumes, but they were published simultaneously. They were not published simultaneously. The first volume appeared in 1783. It at once became enormously popular and was read to shreds. Hence it is that this volume is very scarce. The second volume came out 3 years later, and of course the publisher, guided by its success with the first volume, printed a larger edition and reprinted the first volume. The third volume was published in 1789, whereupon the story became the accepted gift book for all young gentlemen and ladies who are good or intend to be good, to use a phrase of Oliver Goldsmith's. Before me is the copy I read as a boy. It was given to me on my 10th birthday and has since been rebound, the first time for my son, the second time for his children, by R.R. Donnelly and Son Company of Chicago, in an acid-free morocco guaranteed to withstand the ravages of time, if not of children. But I have several other copies. Some years ago I bought a newly rebound set from Mag's Brothers of London. The first volume was the second edition. The second and third volumes were the first edition. It was the set of commerce, and every time I looked at it, it pained me. There is no satisfaction in a book that is not right. So one fine day, when I found a set all first editions, the first volume presented by the author, to whom do you think? Sabrina, now Sarah Bicknell, I at once secured it, and thereupon sold my first set at the sale of the books of a busted bibliophile for $25. But somehow I missed the book, and when, not long after, I read of a better set in Walter Hill's catalogue for $9, identical with the set I had sold, except that it was in original binding, which made it better, I instantly secured it. To leave the book and return to its author. Thomas Day was full of good intentions, but his methods of putting them into effect were largely self-defeating. He wanted to enter Parliament, but he could not bring himself to grovel for votes, and how else were votes to be had then or now? He interested himself in all the questions of the day, in agriculture, in breeding animals, and he came to an untimely death in 1789, just after he published the last volume of his book. He had always held that any animal could be controlled by kindness. With this idea in mind, although a poor horseman, he attempted to ride an unbroken colt that he had reared, fed, and, as he thought, tamed with his own hand. Mounting the animal, he started on a journey, was thrown, landed on his head, and almost immediately died, whereupon his wife retired to her room and never left it, except at night. She declined ever again to look upon the sun, and in 2 years the poor lady passed away, dying of a broken heart. So much for Sandford and Merton. I shall not attempt to conceal my enthusiasm for the Rollo books. They were a constant joy to me. With Rollo and the all-knowing Mr. George in imagination, I was constantly crossing the Atlantic and visiting London and Paris. And when 10 years later I actually followed in his footsteps, I found how true was the author's statement that the Rollo books were intended to instruct as well as to amuse, and that not only the descriptions, but the customs, usages, and modes of life in the countries visited, as well as the characters of the incidents and adventures met with, were in most strict accordance with fact. Unaccustomed to foreign travel, and with only Rollo's experience to guide me, I at 20 crossed the Atlantic, visited London and Paris, and the Rhine country and Switzerland, and got into no difficulties out of which I was unable to extricate myself. I was letter perfect in Rollo, and immediately upon my arrival in Liverpool, when at the landing stage a porter took my solitary valise, and asking me to what hotel I was going to, I, like him, said, "To the best hotel," whereupon I was driven to Adelphi. And so it was throughout the trip, with this difference, however, that Rollo was travelling with a rich and wise Mr. George, while I was quite alone. It was Rollo in London that prepared me in some measure for the thrill of that great city. With him in mind, I visited Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's. With him, I took a penny steamer on the river, and observed that the smokestack had a hinge in it, which admitted of its being turned back as the boat passed under a bridge. Everything just as it should have been. And when I was no longer a boy, and had not yet become a man, I read in a love story written by a novelist who was later to be a Prime Minister of England, a description of a lad's emotion, which was not unlike my own, upon seeing London town for the first time. Ferdinand Armine, for so the lad was called, first saw the city from a mail coach as it dashed along its illuminated streets, the guard sounding his bugle with energy. That is the way to make one's entrance into a great city, not as one does nowadays by a railway station or sneaking in through a tunnel. Is this London? Armine whispered to his tutor. He was assured that it was. Each minute the streets seemed to grow more spacious and brilliant, and the multitude more dense and excited. Beautiful buildings rose before him, palaces and churches and streets, suggesting to his inexperienced eye a never-ending triumph. Is this Charing Cross, sir? Shall we be able to get over? Is this the fullest part of town? Whose house is that? Northumberland House? Does the Duke live there? Who is that? What is that? The Admiralty. Oh, let me see the Admiralty. The Horse Guards. Oh, where? Let us set our watches by the Horse Guards. The guards of coach always sets his watch by the Horse Guards. Which is the best clock, the Horse Guards or St. Paul's? Is that the Treasury? Can we go in? What do they do in Downing Street? Is this Charing Cross still, or is this Parliament Street? Where does Charing Cross end, and where does Parliament Street begin? Oh, by Jove, I see Westminster Abbey. It was in a similar mood that I first saw London, and I wish that I could have continued Armine's ecstatic experiences later, when he met the object of his affections. How well do I remember the lady! She had dark and lustrous locks, and a pellucid brow. Only 18, yet her figure and bearing was that of a goddess. We have Disraeli's word for it. And her beauty so entrancing that her lover was frequently forced to withdraw, pale and panting with a passion from her presence, only to hear as he leaned against an oak tree under her window, the leaves of that same oak murmur in his ear the name of the radiant Henrietta. Now that is what I call emotion. I suppose few people today read Henrietta Temple, but it was once considered the best love story in the language, and I am not sure that it is not. Maybe it is well to take your Henrietta Temple when you are very young or very old, as the case may be. There are certain books which one must read first in one's youth, or not at all. Lucille is one of them, and anyone who has not been taught to read Dickens in his youth should go back and grow up all over again. Ah, if we could. As a small boy, how many hours I spent with Great Expectations. Children love to be told the same story, or have a book read to them which they know by heart. In like manner, I read over and over again Great Expectations. Not all of it, but the opening chapters. How often did I go with Pip to the churchyard where he encountered the convict, and to be tilted? How I despised his uncle, Mr. Pumblechook. How I sometimes think my present loathing for figures is due to his wretched habit of settling Pip problems in mental arithmetic. Who could be expected to do such a sum at 7 times 9 on an empty stomach, or indeed on any stomach at all? How I rejoiced when that miserable man drank the tar water in mistake for brandy at the Christmas dinner. How sorry I was when the soldiers caught the convict, and how I loved honest Joe Gargy, though I fear I was a little ashamed of him. Could anything be more fascinating than Pip's description to his sister, that Turgament of his first visit to Miss Havisham, and Estella, and Pip's fight with the young man, and the rewarding kiss that Estella permitted Pip to give her? How I wished myself in his place. I have always maintained that the first chapters of Great Expectations, up to the time when Pip goes to London, are the best that Dickens ever wrote. The story tails off somewhat, I think, and now I feel that his author was at fault in ending the story as he does. But that only shows the immense genius of the man. With all his blunders, he wrote hundreds of pages that he should have blotted. Charles Dickens was the greatest novelist that ever lived. There is nothing like being certain in matters of taste. To return to the Rollo books. They were published in the 1850s. I suggest that a publisher could do much worse than reprint the entire series, and had been out of print for many years. I once sat next to a charming woman at dinner. I seem always to be sitting next to charming women at dinner, but this is the chief reward for successful amateur authorship. Charming women are constantly being sacrificed to us. When discovering that I had forgotten or had not caught her name when I was presented to her, I asked it. Mrs. Abbott, I was told. I wonder, I mused, whether you are any relation to Rollo. No, but my husband is. I married my second cousin, his grandfather, when Jacob Abbott, who wrote the Rollo books, while my grandfather was his brother John, who wrote The Life of Napoleon. I was on in an instant. How well do I remember that so-called Life? It was published in 2 large volumes. What has become of them? By Harper's. When it was still possible to get excellent woodcut illustrations in books, and these volumes had them. How I devoured this book as a lad. It made the Count of Monte Cristo commonplace, as well as it might, for what story out of the Arabian Nights was ever more sensational than the dullest life of that remarkable man? And Abbott's life was not dull. No fact ever stood in the biographer's way. He made Napoleon a god, and such for many years he seemed to me, until I came to know better. And there across the table was a man who might have been Rollo's grandson. What distinguished lineage! When an opportunity occurred, I told him of a Rollo party I had attended not long before, at which an eminent lawyer and distinguished collector, Hampton L. Carson, had talked about the Rollo books with an enthusiasm which quite carried away his audience. And it was, I think, Amy Lowell's knowledge and love of Rollo which endeared her to me. In my bundle of the books of my childhood, I found a copy of The Silver Rifle, which almost, but not quite, made a hunter of me. A battered Arabian Nights, or Robinson Crusoe, much the worse for wear, and the Swiss Family Robinson, which, as I look at it across the chasm of 50 years, I like best of all the books I had. This, like its fellows Sandford and Merton, has been twice rebound, the last time in a morocco worthy of its merit, if indeed such leather exists. It was while lunching with Dr. Rosenbach one day that the subject of children's books came up, and he told me of the exhibition of them he was then preparing for the New York Public Library. Until that time, few people knew that this scholarly old bachelor had the finest collection of early American children's books in private hands. Said I to Rosie, "You remember that presentation, Sandford and Merton, you sold me some time back? Well, now sell me another. I want a first edition of Swiss Family Robinson. I have seen the Doctor nonplussed, but not often." Finally he said, "I have never seen a first edition of Swiss Family Robinson. I ought to have one in my children's collection. I don't believe that there ever was a first edition." Then he too waxed enthusiastic over the book, and finally the conversation changed. Later that very day, I wrote to my London friend, Francis Edward, the excellent bookseller in the Marylebone High Street, and asked if he had a first edition of the Swiss Family Robinson, or if he had ever seen a copy. In due course I received his reply. Neither he nor anyone in his shop had ever seen or heard of a first edition of the book. It must be very rare. If he ever came across one, he would report it. A week later, a copy of the book was on my desk with a letter from Edwards, stating that the book was in his shop when he had written before, that he had no idea where it came from or what it was worth, but that it must be exceedingly rare, that he was putting merely a nominal price upon it, and if I did not want it, it could be returned. Eagerly I opened the package and found 2 small volumes bound in old half-calf and published by, whom do you suppose? Mary Jane Godwin, at the Juvenile Library, 41 Skinner Street, Snow Hill, London, 1814. I could scarcely believe my eyes. Shelley's stepmother-in-law, she of the green spectacles, the woman that Charles Lamb hated, and the only one knowing what we knew now of the composition of the firm of M.J. Goodwin and Company in 1816, it is interesting to think that Shelley's money may have financed the translation and publication of that first edition of the famous book. And here is the title page of that first edition. And as you can see, Swiss Family Robinson was published under a slightly different title in its first edition. It was in that year that Godwin would neither see nor speak to Shelley, who had just run away with his daughters. He had, however, no objection, indeed, quite the reverse, to borrowing money from him, provided that the checks or drafts were not made payable directly to him. In those days, the book was called The Family Robinson Crusoe. A few days after this event, Walter Hill, the well-known bookseller of Chicago, was spending a night with me, and I gleefully showed him my purchase, and was amazed to hear him say, quite casual-like, "Oh yes, I know the book. I think I have a copy." Of course, I asked to have a look at it, and upon its arrival, I found that the copy I had received from London was the entire book in 2 volumes, whereas Mr. Hill's copy in 2 volumes was published by John Stockdale in 1788, but it contained only the first half of the book. So my pretty theories went a glimmering. But now we enter upon almost as pretty a bibliographical puzzle as is supplied by Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, than which nothing is more perplexing. The Swiss Family Robinson, as we shall continue to call it, was written in German late in the 18th century by a David Weiss, a Swiss military chaplain. It was founded on a report of the discovery of a Swiss pastor who had been shipwrecked on an island near New Guinea. The story, as it was originally written, was intended to be read aloud in the family circle of the writer, but its popularity was such that a publisher was at length sought, and the first part of the narrative was published under a long and complicated German title at Zurich in 1812. 1 year later, the second and concluding volume was published. It was from this edition that the Godwin translation was made, by whom we do not know. Meantime, the attention of a French woman, a Baroness de Montiel, had been attracted to the work, and she, in reading the story, considered that it ended too abruptly, whereupon she secured the permission of Professor Weiss, the son of the author who is now dead, to amend it. An edition was published in French at Paris in 1824. From that time to this, it has been regarded as a French classic and published frequently. The French, who care nothing for foreign travel, don't give a hoot where Crusoe, as they call him, was wrecked, and in one illustrated edition, Ce Brave Robinson is depicted as a Viking living on a coral reef surrounded by kangaroos and other strange animals. Now that the war is over, I suppose I may safely express my opinion of the French. They are preeminently the selfish nation of the world. As long as all goes right with France, the rest of the world may go hang. We are told the logic is their strong point. And here we have another title page from an edition of Robinson Crusoe. "How logical you are this morning," says one Frenchman to another, meeting him in the street, where we should say, "How well you are looking." But their logical and clear thinking stops short at the boundaries of France. Outside of France there is chaos only, and it does not interest them. I observed a curious instance of this recently. Some French newspapers started a discussion as to whether there really had been 10 first-class men of letters in the whole world. Finally, it was agreed that there had been, and the list was published. It included Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. The remaining 7 were French. The edition of the Swiss Family Robinson, which is now current in this country and in England, is not the translation published by Godwin, which is indeed very poor, but appears to be a translation from the French, which was itself translated from the German. No copy of the book can compare, to my mind, with the little volume in which, more than 50 years ago, I first read the story. It was published by Routledge and Sons, and has fascinating plates in color. But this is a mere prejudice, for Harper's have recently published a far better edition, also admirably illustrated by Louis Reed, with an introduction by W. D. Howells, who, curiously enough, had never read the book until he did preparatory to writing the introduction. I believe most boys prefer the Swiss Family Robinson to Robinson Crusoe. I know that I did. There is, of course, a certain resemblance in the 2 books, but Defoe antedated Weiss by 100 years. Defoe's hero is of all the ship's company, the only man saved from the wreck, whereas in Weiss, father, mother, and 4 sons are saved. In each case, the stranded ship affords supplies, but the incidents of the Swiss story are more varied and interesting. No page has its thrill for a boy. No page but has its thrill for a boy. Moral reflections are plentiful in both. There is, of course, no really great moment in the Swiss story comparable with the discovery of the man's naked footprint in the sand in Defoe, this incident being the first really great bit of what we call realism in a novel. If Robinson Crusoe is a novel as to which there is much discussion. May I digress for a moment? Of course I may. Life full of digressions. Treasure Island. There is a boy's book, if you will. There is no mushy love stuff in it, but sheer adventure, and by the time RLS came to hold a pen, it was not considered good form to point a moral on every page. It was written to illustrate a map, and I am the proud owner of the original sketch from which the published map was reproduced. It has an interesting story which Stevenson himself wrote under the title of My First Book. in which he told how his famous romance came to be written. The original map, which inspired the book, was made in collaboration with Mr. Lloyd Osborne, then a schoolboy with a taste for drawing. Of it, Stevenson says that he made the map of an island. It was elaborately, and I thought, beautifully colored. The shape of it took my fancy beyond expression. It contained harbors that pleased me like sonnets. With the unconsciousness of the predestined, I ticketed my performance Treasure Island. And here is the original Treasure Island map. Farther on in the same article, he recounts the sad fate of the first map and tells how the present map, which is known through reproduction to thousands of his readers, came to be drawn. This time came when it was decided to publish, and I sent in my manuscript and the map along with it to Messrs. Castle. The proofs came, they were corrected, but I heard nothing of the map. I wrote and asked, was told it had never been received, and sat aghast. It is one thing to draw a map at random, set to a scale in one corner of it as a venture, and write up a story of the measurements. It is quite another to have to examine a whole book, make an inventory of all the illusions contained in it, and with a pair of compasses, painfully design a map to suit the data. I did it, and the map was drawn again in my father's office, with embellishments of blowing whales and sailing ships, and my father himself brought into service a knack he had of various writing, and elaborately forged the signature of Captain Flint and the sailing directions of Billy Bones. The map measures, in the drawing, 16 by 10 inches and is beautifully drawn in exact imitation of an old engraved map of the period of the story, with an elaborate vignette at top depicting mermen with dolphins and seabirds, and further embellished with sailing vessels of the 18th century. The forged notes of Captain Flint and Billy Bones, as above described, also appear. So obviously this is the second map reproduced there. This is the same map I showed you just a moment ago, but just to clarify, this is the second map, as the first map was lost. At a spot on the island, a notation in red ink reads, "Bulk of treasure here." To the northeast are the sailing directions of Billy Bones, and below is Captain Flint's note of Treasure Island, dated August 1st, 1750, in facsimile of chart, latitude and longitude struck out by J. Hawkins. Under this is written, "Given above J.F. to Mr. W. Bones, mate of ye Walrus Savannah, this 20 July, 1754, W.B." Some day this map will be very valuable. Indeed, it has been suggested that it already is. My well-read Swiss family is before me, and as I turn its pages, the years fall upon my shoulders, and I am a boy again. How, as a boy, I longed to be cast on some desert island, where I could go out and gather sugar-cane, which I could suck like a stick of candy, where monkeys swung from tree to tree, which attacked with stones returned the affront with a shower of coconuts, where water turtles big enough to tow a boat, mind you, were common, whereas the type with which I was familiar simply withdrew within itself when poked with a stick, in a most uninteresting manner. How dull, flat, stale, and unprofitable my youth was, I thought. But actually all the time I was living in fairyland, the fairyland of a book. And now, old man that I am, I have discovered that there is no fairyland except in books, and this fairyland is within the reach of all of us. So that brings us to the end of chapter 3 on the books of my boyhood. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back on Saturday with chapter 4 here, titled When We Were Very Young. And in case you haven't been following along, I am reading A. Edward Newton in collaboration with Sean D. Standfast, who is reading on the days that I am not, from the amenities of book collecting. So I'll link him in the description below, and be sure to check out his read aloud videos as well. I hope that you enjoyed this.